The morning Dorothy Briggs woke up and found the notice tacked to her front door. She stood on the porch in her housecoat for a long time without moving. The paper was official looking, dense with language she didn't understand, stamped with a company name she barely remembered seeing before. Ridgeline Partners. The words meant nothing to her the first time she'd encountered them. And they meant even less now, except that they were somehow connected to the worst mistake of her life, which was trusting a man in a nice suit who came to her door 3 weeks ago and told her the government had a new program that could help pay for her arthritis medication. Earl would have known better. Earl had always known better when it came to men like that. Men whose shoes cost more than his first truck. Men who smiled too long and laughed too easy and looked at everything around them like it was already theirs. He'd grown up poor in this county, the same as she had, and he'd learned early how to read the ones who wanted to take from people who had nothing to spare. But Earl was gone. Earl had been gone for 40 years, taken at Beirut when the barracks came down, and the person left standing on this porch was just Dorothy, 74 years old with bad knees and a fixed income, and nobody coming to check on her. She took the notice inside, folded it twice, and set it on the kitchen table next to her coffee cup. Then she fed the cat, a gray old Tom named Sergeant, who had been with her 11 years and still slept on Earl's side of the bed. She watched the coffee brew. The house was quiet the way it always was in the mornings, that deep Appalachian quiet where you could hear a cardinal in the maple tree out back and the creak of the floorboards under your feet, and nothing else. She'd lived in this house for 41 years. She and Earl had bought it together the spring after he came back from his first deployment. Young and dumb and so glad to be alive, they'd signed the papers without even having someone look them over. The walls had scuff marks at knee height from when Danny was small, her boy, and she'd never painted over them because even now, even though Danny was in Portland and called twice a year if she was lucky, those marks were him at 4 years old running through the hallway with his shoes on, and she needed that. She needed every inch of this house. It was the only thing she had left that still held the shape of the life she'd built. Ridgeline Partners. She picked up the notice again. The language inside talked about a transfer of title in a 30-day completion period and something called a default clause that she couldn't make heads or tails of. She recognized her own signature at the bottom of the attached document, and looking at it now, at the shaky, careful letters she'd formed while the man named Garrett Flynn watched her with that patient smile, she felt a cold that had nothing to do with the October air coming through the kitchen window. She'd signed it. She hadn't known what it was, hadn't known what she was signing, but she'd signed it. Flynn had sat across her kitchen table with a folder full of papers, and he'd explained each page in simple, friendly language. Federal Assistance Program. Just routine paperwork. A lot of folks your age are taking advantage of this. He'd been so calm, so reassuring, that she'd stopped reading halfway through and just trusted him. Because that's what you did with people who seemed to know things. That's what you did when you were tired and your hands hurt and you hadn't had another adult to talk to in 3 days. She'd kept one thing. Ruth had told her to do that a long time ago, Ruth Gallagher at the Millstone, who had worked that counter since before Dorothy could remember, and who'd seen enough sad stories come through that door to fill a library. Whenever somebody official-looking gives you something to sign, Ruth had said more than once, you take it to the post office and make a copy before you hand it back. Don't give them your only copy of anything. Dorothy had done it out of habit more than suspicion. She'd slipped the original documents out of the folder while Flynn was refreshing his coffee, and she'd folded them into her apron pocket, and later that afternoon she'd driven to the post office and made copies on the machine by the door. She hadn't really thought about why. It had just felt right. Now she went to the drawer where she kept important papers, and she pulled out her copies and she set them next to the notice, and she looked at the signature page. And then she looked again, more carefully this time, leaning in close because her reading glasses weren't quite right for this distance. The signature on the copy was hers. The signature on the page attached to the notice was also hers, or something like it. But the two weren't identical. The one on the notice was smoother, more even. None of the slight tremor you got in her hand when she wrote for too long. Someone had copied her signature. They'd taken what she'd written and reproduced it, cleaned it up, made it look more deliberate than she'd ever managed. It was hers and it wasn't hers, And if she hadn't had the original to compare it to, she never would have known. She sat with that for a while. She thought about calling the county, but she wasn't sure who to call. She thought about calling a lawyer, but the only lawyer she knew had retired. And finding another one and explaining all of this felt like something that required more energy than she currently had. She thought about calling Danny, but the last time she'd tried to tell Danny about a problem, he'd suggested she look into assisted living, and that conversation had cost her 3 days of not being able to eat. So she put the papers in her purse, both sets, the notice and her copies, and she decided that what she needed right now, before she figured any of this out, was a cup of tea at the millstone and a conversation with Ruth, who had seen everything and never panicked and always knew what to do. She walked out to her car, a 10-year-old Buick with a dent in the rear quarter panel that Earl's brother had put there backing out of a funeral and never had fixed. The maple tree in the front yard had gone full orange. A crow sat on the mailbox and watched her back out of the drive without moving. The mountains on the far side of the valley were layered blue and gray in the morning light, the way they always were in October, old and permanent and unmoved by anything that happened beneath them. She'd been to the millstone every Friday for 12 years. She knew every face in that place, or she used to. The county had changed some. New people coming in, younger ones, from somewhere else, the way they always did when there was money to be made in the hills. She drove Route 119 with the window cracked, smelling wood smoke from somewhere up the hollow, and she tried to figure out what she was going to say to Ruth. She was halfway through that thought when she noticed the truck parked across from her driveway. Dark blue, new. She'd seen it there yesterday too. She hadn't thought anything of it then. She thought about it now. The millstone sat at the intersection where 119 met the old coal road, a low building with wood paneling that hadn't been updated since 1987, and a hand-painted sign over the door that was missing the second L. Ruth had run it since her husband passed, and before that, her husband had run it, and before that, his mother. The coffee was terrible, and the eggs were perfect, and the booths had been reupholstered twice, but the cracks in the vinyl still showed through. There was a jukebox against the far wall that worked, but nobody ever put money in it because it only had albums from 1974, and people either loved those songs or thought they were beneath mentioning. Dorothy came in at 10:15. Ruth looked up from behind the counter, and Dorothy saw the woman's eyes go directly to her face, to the bruise along her cheekbone, to the split in her lower lip, and Ruth's expression went very still in the way it did when she was controlling herself. The bruise was from 2 days before. Flynn had come back. He hadn't been alone that time. He'd come with a younger man, someone who didn't introduce himself, and when Dorothy had tried to tell them she didn't want to go forward with whatever the document said, that she'd made a mistake and wanted it undone, Flynn had stopped smiling. He'd put his hand on her arm in a way that felt like a warning, and when she'd stepped back from him, she'd walked into the corner of the kitchen table. She'd told herself it was an accident. She'd been telling herself that for 2 days. She'd worn the bruise into the diner on a Friday like she always did, and she tried to smile at Ruth and hadn't quite managed it. Ruth came around the counter without saying a word and guided her to the corner booth by the window, the one Dorothy always preferred, and she'd brought tea without being asked, and she'd leaned over and said in a low voice, "Tell me everything, honey." Dorothy tried. She started with Flynn and the paperwork and the signature she now believed was forged and the notice on her door. Ruth listened without interrupting, her expression staying carefully neutral, and by the time Dorothy had finished, Ruth had refilled the tea and her jaw was set in a way that meant she was quietly furious. "I know a woman at the county assessor's office," Ruth said. "I'm going to call her this afternoon, and I want you to take everything you just told me and write it down, all of it, dates and names and everything he said word for word as best you can remember it. You have your copy of those papers?" Dorothy touched her purse. "Right here." "Good," Ruth said. "Don't let those out of your sight." It was a normal Friday morning. There were 2 truckers near the window eating in companionable silence. There were 2 older men in the middle booth, Harold and James, who came in most days and argued about the University of Kentucky's football program with the sustained commitment of people who had been having the same argument for years and found it comfortable. A young woman, maybe late 20s, sat in the booth by the door with a toddler who was dismantling a packet of crackers with tremendous seriousness. The jukebox was off. The coffee pot was going. The television above the counter had a weather forecast playing on mute. In the back corner, a man sat alone with black coffee and eggs and wheat toast. He was maybe 58, broad at the shoulder with a neck like a fence post and hands that had been broken and healed more than once. He wore a leather cut over a flannel shirt, black and worn soft at the shoulder seams, with a patch across the back that read Iron Covenant MC, and beneath that, Harlan County. He ate slowly and read nothing and looked at nothing in particular, but missed nothing at all. His name was Cole Weaver. He'd been coming to the millstone since he'd moved back to the county 7 years ago, after the roads had taken him everywhere they could, and he'd decided that the only place that still felt like something was the place where he'd started. He'd grown up 15 miles east of here, had joined the Marines at 19, done 2 tours and come home carrying things he never talked about, had found the club in his late 30s and found in it something like the unit he'd left behind. Men who understood the same language. He didn't make conversation at the millstone. He nodded at Ruth, tipped well, and kept to himself. He'd been watching Dorothy since she walked in. Not obviously, not in a way that would have drawn attention, but with the peripheral awareness of a man trained to read rooms. He'd seen the bruise. He'd seen the way she held her arm close to her ribs when she moved, the unconscious self-protection of someone with something tender underneath. He'd seen Ruth's face when she looked at her. He'd seen the dog tags against Dorothy's chest, dull military metal on a thin chain, a man's name stamped into them in the way the Corps stamped the names of all the men who went, the names worn almost smooth from decades of being touched. He knew what those tags cost to carry. He'd carried something like them himself, not literally, but in the place where the weight of the ones who didn't come back lives in a person who did. The booth creaked when he shifted his weight. He was on his second cup when the door opened and the man walked in. Dorothy saw him first because she was facing the door. She went white the way people go white when the thing they've been afraid of comes through a door. Her hand stopped moving. Her cup settled back into its saucer without a sound. Garrett Flynn walked in wearing the same pressed shirt he'd worn to her kitchen. He scanned the room the way someone does when they've already decided what they're going to do and are just confirming there's nothing in the way. He found Dorothy in the corner booth. He walked toward her without acknowledging anyone else in the room. He sat down across from her without being invited. He set the folder on the table. He said in a voice just low enough that only the nearby tables could hear, "We need to resolve this today, Dorothy. We've been patient. The 30 days are almost up, and my employer isn't someone who likes loose ends." Dorothy's hands were shaking. "I don't owe you anything," she said. "That signature isn't mine." Flynn's expression didn't change. He reached into the folder and produced the contract, turned it so the signature faced her, and tapped it with one finger. "Courts don't care what you think you signed," he said. "They care what the paper says." "That's not my signature," Dorothy said, and this time her voice was louder, clear enough that the 2 truckers glanced over. Ruth looked up from the register. Flynn leaned forward. He said, "Keep your voice down." Dorothy looked at that signature, the clean forged lines of it, and then she looked at Flynn's face, the patient, thin-lipped certainty of a man who had done this before and expected it to go the way it had always gone. She'd been afraid of him for 3 weeks. She'd been afraid since before she even understood what she should be afraid of. And sitting there in the diner she'd been coming to for 12 years, with Ruth behind the counter and the smell of coffee in the air and Earl's dog tags against her sternum, she was still afraid, but she was also, underneath it, angry. For the first time she was truly, properly angry. She said louder still, "I did not sign my house over to anyone. You forged my name and I can prove it." The room went quiet. That specific kind of quiet where the ambient sounds don't actually stop, but everything feels hushed anyway, because attention has gathered at one point in the room. Flynn stood. He reached across the table and took Dorothy's wrist in his hand. Not hard, not a full grip, but a warning. A reminder of the kitchen, of the corner of the table, of what he was capable of and what she was not. "Come on," he said, quiet and cold. "We're going to finish this." Dorothy tried to pull her arm back. His grip tightened. He started pulling her up out of the booth, and she was off balance, coming up sideways, and her tea spilled, and her elbow caught the edge of the table, and she cried out, a small sound, involuntary, the sound of pain that's also surprised that the pain is happening. Her shoe slipped off her foot as he pulled her sideways across the vinyl seat. She grabbed the edge of the table with her free hand. The truckers looked at their plates. Harold and James went silent. The young woman with the toddler pulled her child close and looked away. Ruth stood behind the counter holding the coffee pot with both hands, knuckles gone pale, not moving. Nobody moved. A room full of grown adults and nobody moved. In the back corner, Cole Weaver set down his coffee. He didn't slam it. He didn't scrape the chair. He simply set the cup down and stood up, slowly with a complete absence of hurry. And the sound of that booth creaking under his weight as he rose was somehow the loudest thing in the room. Let her go. 2 words, flat and quiet, no performance to them. Flynn stopped. He turned and looked at Cole the way you look at someone who said something in a foreign language, a little confused, a little annoyed. He took in the size of the man, the cut, the scarred hands, the complete and total calm. He decided it didn't concern him. Stay out of it, Flynn said. This is a private matter. Cole walked out from behind the table. Not fast, not aggressive, just walked. Each step even and deliberate, eating up the distance between the back corner and the booth by the window, and with each step, something about the air in the room changed. Some pressure differential that everyone felt, but no one could have named. He stopped about 4 feet from Flynn. He said, "That woman is wearing a dead Marine's tags." Nobody in the room had noticed the dog tags until he said it. Now everyone looked. "And you've got her by the arm like she's luggage," Cole said. "So I'm going to say it one more time, and then we're going to find out what comes after." He looked at Flynn with the patient, specific expression of a man who had made his decisions well in advance of needing them and had nothing in particular to prove to anyone. "Let her go." Flynn's jaw tightened. He was the kind of man who mistook stubbornness for strength, who'd gotten away with things for so long that the idea of being stopped still registered as an insult before it registered as a fact. His free hand moved, just slightly, toward his waistband. Cole said, "Don't." Soft, almost kind. The single word of someone who'd seen that gesture 100 times and found it tiresome. "Whatever you're reaching for," Cole said, "you don't want to find out how this ends if you reach for it. Not in here. Not with these people watching." Flynn's hand stopped. He looked at Cole's face and found nothing theatrical there. No anger, no readiness to be tested. Just a flatness that was somehow worse than anger because it suggested the man had already moved past the part where he would need to feel anything about what happened next. Flynn let go. Dorothy's wrist came free and she stumbled, and Cole caught her by the shoulders, gentle as a man catching something fragile, and steadied her on her feet. Flynn backed up a step, trying to gather himself. "This isn't over," he said. "It is right now," Cole said. "Walk." And Flynn walked. He shouldered his way to the door, not running, because men like that couldn't afford to run in front of witnesses, but moving with enough speed that the bell over the door rang hard on his way out. An engine started in the parking lot. Tires on gravel. Gone. Cole knelt down, picked up the shoe that had come off Dorothy's foot, and slid it back onto her foot. Simple, quiet, without comment. He stood, waved a hand toward Ruth, who was already moving with a glass of water. Dorothy's hands had stopped shaking enough to hold it. She drank. Her breathing slowed. Ruth said something to her, low and careful, the same tone she'd used when Dorothy walked in. "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" The way you talk to someone after something bad has stopped happening to them. "Thank you," Dorothy said to Cole. She looked up at him, this stranger in a leather jacket who had just rearranged the entire structure of her afternoon. "Thank you." Cole sat down across from her. He said, "You're all right now." She touched the dog tags at her throat, Earl's name worn into the metal. He'd been 27 when the barracks collapsed. She'd been 23. They'd been married 4 years. Cole noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. "Who is he?" Cole said. "The man who just left." She told him. Garrett Flynn, Ridgeline Partners. The paperwork, the forged signature, the notice on her door. She told it quickly, in the efficient way of someone who's been carrying a thing so long they've got it down to the essentials. Cole listened without interrupting. "How many?" he said when she finished. She looked at him. "What? How many other houses? You think it's just yours?" She hadn't thought about it like that. She reached into her purse and took out the copy of the contract. She unfolded it and set it on the table. Cole looked at it without touching it. "You've got the original," he said. "The one you made a copy of before you gave it back." She tapped the paper. "I copied this before I handed anything over. Ruth told me to always keep a copy." Cole looked at the signature on the copy and then at Dorothy's hands. It wasn't hard to see the difference between what her trembling hand had produced and what a careful forgery would look like on the altered version. Ruth came back with more tea and a fresh cup of coffee for Cole that he hadn't asked for. She said to Dorothy, I'm calling Marlene at the assessor's office the minute this lunch crowd dies down. She looked at Cole. You want anything else? Cole said he was fine. The room had gone back to something approaching normal. The truckers were eating again. Harold and James had resumed their argument, quieter now. The young woman with the toddler was watching her child dismantle a second cracker packet with less focus than before, her attention still partly on the table by the window, on the old woman with the bruised cheek and the man across from her. Her name was Penny Slater. She was 29, had grown up 2 counties over, had a son named Marcus who was 2 3/4, and very serious about crackers. She had her phone on the table beside her coffee cup, screen down. She'd been recording since the moment Flynn had grabbed Dorothy's wrist. She hadn't consciously decided to do it. She'd just looked up and seen what was happening, and her hand had moved. She didn't know yet that the recording was going to matter. She just knew that something had happened in this room that felt important and that she wanted to have it. The afternoon felt quiet now. The danger had walked out the door. The sun was coming through the window at an angle that lit up the steam from the coffee cups and made the whole place look softer than it was. Dorothy sat with her tea, both hands wrapped around the cup, and the bruise on her cheek was dark, but her eyes had changed. Something returning to them, some steadiness that had been absent when she'd walked in. Cole looked at the door. He was thinking about the dark blue truck parked across from her driveway, which she'd mentioned without realizing she'd mentioned it. He was thinking about a man in a pressed shirt who'd walked into a public diner and grabbed a 74-year-old woman by the wrist in front of 20 people, which meant he wasn't afraid of witnesses, which meant he had a reason not to be afraid. He was thinking that men who ran this kind of operation did not run it alone. He was thinking that walking out that door and getting on his bike might be the last comfortable thing he got to do for a while. He finished his coffee. He didn't leave. 12 minutes later, the bell over the door rang again. Flynn came in first, then 3 other men behind him, larger, the kind who dressed for utility rather than appearance, jackets that hung wrong because of what was underneath. And behind all of them, walking last and unhurried as someone who'd never once had to run from anything, came a 5th man. Silver hair cut close, a gray suit that hadn't come off any rack, the kind of calm that money buys and practice maintains. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. He looked around slowly, the way an appraiser looks at an estate. Then he nodded once, and one of his men turned, flipped the deadbolt on the front door, and reached up and turned the sign in the window from open to closed. The lock clicked, the sign turned, and the temperature of the room dropped by 10 degrees. His name was Conrad Decker. 40 years ago, he'd been a county commissioner, and before that, a coal company lawyer, and before that, a boy from Lexington who'd looked at this part of the state and decided it was something to be extracted from rather than lived in. He was 63 now, and he'd spent 30 of those years perfecting the art of taking things from people who didn't know they could fight back. He spread his hands in a gesture of apology. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man who has never once meant anything he said. "I apologize for the disruption. My associate handled a sensitive private matter in a way that was less than ideal. We're just going to clear that up, and then everyone can get back to their day." He turned and looked at Dorothy, and the warmth in his voice dropped away as cleanly as a mask removed. "Mrs. Briggs, I'm going to ask you to come with us. We'll get this resolved in a way that works for everyone." Dorothy said, "I'm not going anywhere with you." Decker said, "I think you are." His tone was the tone of someone correcting a minor misapprehension. Then one of Decker's men pulled his jacket back, slow and deliberate, and there on his belt was a deputy's badge. The room saw it. Everyone in the room saw it. The message could not have been clearer. Don't bother calling the law. The law is standing right here. The law drove here in one of our cars, and it does what we tell it. Penny Slater looked at her phone on the table. Screen down, still recording. She didn't reach for it. She didn't want to break whatever was happening, didn't want to draw attention to it. She just looked at it and then back up at the man with the badge and felt something cold move through her. Ruth, behind the counter, had a phone of her own behind the register. She needed 6 inches and 15 seconds to get to it. She was calculating. Cole sat in the back booth and looked at Decker and the 4 men with him, and the deputy's badge and the locked door, and the 20 people pressed back toward the walls. And he did the arithmetic the way he'd done it in worse places than this. He stood up. Decker looked at him for the first time. "Who are you?" Cole said, "Nobody. Man who was eating his eggs." Decker said, "Then sit down and finish them. This isn't your concern." Cole said, "You flipped the sign." Decker paused. "That tells me," Cole said, "that you're not planning to let people walk out of here and say what they saw." So let's stop pretending this is about paperwork. Decker regarded him. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a fold of cash thick enough to choke a horse and set it on the nearest table. That's $5,000, he said. You get on your bike and you forget today happened. The woman comes with us. Everybody goes home. No one gets hurt. Cole looked at the money. He looked at Dorothy, at the bruise on her cheek, at Earl's tags against her chest. Keep your money, he said. The words were quiet, but they filled the room. You can't buy what I'm standing on. Decker's composure fractured, just for a second, one hairline cracked through the surface. Then he made a small gesture with two fingers and his men started moving. The first man came fast, the way men do when they're paid to end things quickly. He covered the distance between himself and Cole in 3 strides, swinging a fist aimed at the side of Cole's head. Cole turned his chin just enough that the punch swept past. He caught the man's wrist on the follow-through and used the momentum, using the man's own committed weight as a lever, and drove him face first into the edge of the counter. The sound was significant. The man slid down and sat against the base of the counter and did not get up. The second one grabbed a chair from the nearest table and raised it above his head. Cole stepped inside the arc before it could come down, put an elbow into the man's solar plexus, and when the chair dropped and the man folded, Cole put a short hook into his jaw that turned his legs to water. He went down sideways. The third man slowed. He looked at the 2 men on the floor, both down in under 4 seconds, and he looked at Cole, who was standing with his hands relaxed at his sides and the same expression he'd had when he was eating his eggs. And something behind the man's eyes did a calculation and came up short. You sure? Cole said to him quietly. The man decided he wasn't sure. He took a step back. Flynn had watched all of this happen and it had broken something in him. Or maybe it had just finally revealed something that the pressed shirt and the patient smile had been covering for a long time. He'd been embarrassed once in front of his boss already. He grabbed a steak knife off the nearest table, one of the cheap flatware ones that every roadside diner keeps in a napkin holder on the table, and came at Cole low and fast, angling for the ribs. Cole shifted his weight backward, and Flynn's thrust went into air. Cole's hands came together on Flynn's knife wrist, a two-handed grip, and twisted. Not violently, not dramatically, simply applied the correct amount of force in the correct direction. There was a sound like a green branch bending past the point of return. The knife hit the floor. Flynn's scream was high and involuntary, the scream of a body reporting damage before the brain is caught up. Cole walked him backward by that wrist the way you walk a dog that's forgotten its manners, calm and unhurried, and he sat Flynn down hard in an empty booth. He said, "Stay," and Flynn stayed, cradling his arm against his chest, gone white to the hairline, all the menace in him replaced with something much simpler and more honest. It's always the same with men like that. The ones who grab frightened old women in diners are almost never the ones who hold together when someone bigger says no. The cruelty and the cowardice come from the same place. They're 2 faces of the same coin, and you flip one over and you find the other underneath it every time. That left Decker and the deputy with the badge. The deputy's hand moved to his hip. His fingers touched the grip of the service pistol, and he looked at Cole and his jaw was set, and his eyes were full of a thing that was trying to be resolved and wasn't quite making it. Cole looked at him. He said, "Son." His voice was not unkind. "I've had guns pointed at me," Cole said, "by men who'd trained for years at things you've never thought about. So what I'm about to say is not a challenge. It's just what's true." He let that breathe for a moment. "You pull that trigger in a locked room full of witnesses with a badge your boss bought and a contract your boss forged, and you will spend the rest of your working life in a cell. Every person in this room is looking at you right now. Every single face. You are not doing this in a parking lot at 2 in the morning. You are standing in a diner at 11 o'clock on a Friday with 20 people watching you decide." The deputy's hand went still. Not relaxed, not dropped, just still. The way a hand goes still when the brain above it is doing the most important arithmetic of its life. Cole said nothing more. He just waited. Patient and unhurried and entirely without bluff. The way a man waits when he genuinely does not care what happens next, as long as what's right happens first. Decker spoke from across the room. He said, "Deputy," and his voice had taken on the first note of something that hadn't been there before. An edge underneath the smoothness. Not quite desperation. Something in the family of it. The deputy heard it. Something about hearing that note in Decker's voice, the slightest crack in all that expensive certainty, seemed to clarify things. He looked at Decker. He looked at Cole. He looked at the two men on the floor and Flynn in the booth with his wrist held against his chest. Cole said to Decker while he had his attention, "I want you to tell everyone in this room one more time about the lawyers, about your friends at the sheriff's office, about the system, and how it says the house is yours." He paused. "I think some of these folks may not have heard the first time." Decker stared at him. Cole looked at Penny Slater in the booth by the door. Just looked. One glance, no more. She looked back. Her phone was face down on the table and had been since the moment Decker locked the door. And both of them understood something without either of them saying a word. "Go ahead," Cole said. "Tell them about your system." Decker's face had gone the color of old concrete. He understood now what had happened. He'd walked in here and made his case out loud, made it in full sentences with specifics and names, because he was used to rooms where the only person listening was the person he was trying to intimidate, and everyone else had learned to stop their ears. He hadn't counted on a young mother with a 2-year-old who kept her phone face down on the table and was still running. He looked at Penny. He said, "Give me the phone." He started toward her. Cole stepped between them. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't change his expression. He just stepped into the space between Decker and the table and he said, "No." One word, "no." It was the whole story in a syllable. The money hadn't worked. The muscle hadn't worked. The badge hadn't worked. The system that Conrad Decker had spent 40 years building and maintaining and hiding behind had stopped working the moment one man decided to stand up instead of look away. It wasn't complicated. It hadn't required anything except will and the decision to use it. The deputy reached up and unclipped the badge from his belt. He set it on the counter. He said, "I was never here." He walked to the door, unlocked it himself, and left without looking back. That broke whatever remained of Decker's hold on the room. The third man, the one who decided he wasn't sure, went for the door next, moving fast enough that the bell tore half loose from its mount when he shouldered through. Flynn tried to follow, struggling up out of the booth with his bad wrist against his chest, stumbling. Cole let him go. A man running scared with a wrist that wouldn't work was not a threat to anyone. The door swung shut. Decker stood alone in the center of the diner, and the room that had gone so quiet was quiet again, but in a completely different register. Now the quiet was the kind that comes after. The silence of 20 people exhaling at once. The silence of something terrible that did not quite finish happening. Decker looked down at the briefcase on the floor beside him. He looked at Cole. He said, "That is my property." Cole said, "That is evidence. You're going to leave it right here, and you're going to walk out that door, and you're going to hope the real police get to you before any of these people think to call everyone they know." Decker's fingers uncurled from the briefcase handle. His hand came away. He looked around the room one more time, and what he saw in the faces looking back at him must have been something entirely different from what he was accustomed to seeing, because he said nothing, turned, and walked out. The briefcase hit the floor. The room breathed. Ruth came around the counter. One of the truckers stood up and righted a chair that had been knocked over, setting it back on its feet with the careful deliberateness of a man putting something back in order. Harold and James came over to Dorothy's booth and asked if she was all right, and she said she was. She thought she was, and Harold put his hand over hers on the table and left it there. Penny sat very still with her phone and her son, her hands shaking now that it was over, the shaking that comes when the adrenaline finds nowhere to go. Ruth pressed a clean towel wrapped around ice against Dorothy's cheek, gentle as anything. And Dorothy reached into her purse and took out the folded papers, both sets, the notice and her copies, and she set them on the table and she looked at them, and for the first time since she'd found that notice on her door, she felt something other than afraid. Cole sat down across from her. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold during all of this, and he drank it anyway. Ruth was already at the register, where the phone behind the counter was, making the call Dorothy had been too afraid and too exhausted to figure out how to make. She did not call the county sheriff. She called the state police, because she had been watching things go wrong in this county for a year, and she understood which numbers to trust and which to set aside. Outside, through the window, the dark blue truck that had been sitting across Route 119 had disappeared. The afternoon was going to get a lot longer. But for this one moment, the room was still, and the danger had gone, and Ruth was on the phone, and a room full of people who had been looking away was looking at each other instead, really looking. In the way you look when you've just been reminded that what happens to the person next to you is already your business, whether you wanted it to be or not. Cole drank his cold coffee. Dorothy wrapped both hands around her tea. Sergeant, the gray cat, was probably asleep on Earl's side of the bed at this exact moment, unaware that the woman who fed him had just held her ground in a room full of people who were learning, some of them for the first time, that it was possible. Outside, the October light was changing. The mountains sat above the valley the way they always had, old and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the small fierce things that humans did at their feet. But those small fierce things mattered. They had always mattered. That was the part the mountains couldn't teach you. Ruth said into the phone, her voice steady and clear. I need to report something. I need to report several things, and I'll need someone to come take a briefcase as evidence. Yes. Yes, I'll wait. She turned and looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked back. The afternoon held. Let me tell you what it's like to grow up in a county where the land changes hands as regularly as the weather. You learn early that ownership is a word with different meanings depending on which side of it you're standing on. The people who've been here 3 generations understand it one way. The people who come in from outside to buy mineral rights and easements understand it another. And the courts have always had their own interpretation that doesn't map cleanly onto either. Dorothy Briggs had grown up in this county. She'd grown up watching her father fight a coal company for access rights to the spring on his property. A fight that lasted 9 years and cost him more than the property was worth, and ended in a settlement that nobody explained to anyone's satisfaction. She'd grown up understanding that the law was a tool like any other tool, and that the people with money to hire good lawyers had a way of making the tool work for them that people like her father never quite managed to replicate. She'd married Earl at 19 at the Methodist church on the ridge above town, and Earl had been the son of a man who'd worked the mines and had opinions about the companies that owned them. They'd saved for 8 years before they could put a down payment on the little house on Cedar Fork Road, and the day they'd signed those papers had been one of the best days of her life. Better even than she'd expected, because owning a piece of ground in this county after growing up watching her father lose his was something she felt in a way she couldn't have articulated, something below the level of words. She'd raised Danny in that house. She'd buried Earl's service flag in that house, on the shelf above the fireplace, folded in its triangle in the case they'd given her at the funeral. She'd fed neighbors from that kitchen after floods and ice storms and the kinds of losses that accumulate in rural communities over decades. She planted a kitchen garden every spring for 41 years and put up tomatoes and green beans and apple butter every fall. And the shelves in the basement still held her system, the jars organized by year in the way Earl had always teased her about. The idea of losing it had been operating in her like a low-grade fever since the morning she'd found the notice on the door, and what she hadn't quite been able to name until this afternoon was the specific quality of the fear. It wasn't just the loss of property, it was the loss of evidence. Without the house, there was no physical proof that any of it had happened, that Earl had existed, that they'd built something together, that she had managed 40 years of being alone without disappearing entirely. The house was the record. And someone had walked into her kitchen with a nice suit and a forged signature and tried to erase the record. Cole sat across from her in the booth at the millstone and looked at the papers spread between them, and he understood some of what he was looking at without needing it explained. He'd known men who'd come home from overseas to find that the legal machinery had moved against them while they were gone. Men who'd come back to second mortgages they hadn't taken out, and liens filed by people they'd never met. Men who'd been robbed by paper rather than by force because paper left no witnesses and couldn't be punched. He looked at the briefcase Decker had left on the floor. It had fallen on its side when it hit the floor, and the latch had sprung, and the papers inside were visible at the opening. A thick wedge of documents with that same dense legal formatting. More contracts, more signature pages, more of whatever it was that had brought an old woman in a cardigan to a diner on a Friday with a bruised cheek and shaking hands. Ruth was still on the phone, her back turned, speaking carefully and fully to whoever was on the other end. Harold and James had settled in the booth on either side of Dorothy, a deliberate flanking, the kind of positioning that said we are staying. Penny Slater had moved her son to her lap and was holding him with both arms and breathing in the smell of his hair with her eyes closed. Cole looked at the briefcase. He looked at the closed door through which Decker had walked. He looked at Dorothy's face, at the fatigue in it, at the steadiness that was returning to replace the fear. He thought about 34 men scattered across Harlan County and the surrounding ridges. Men he'd ridden with for 7 years. Men who understood what this county meant and what it cost, and who had chosen to stay and build something here rather than extract and leave. He thought about a phone call he was going to need to make before this afternoon was over. But that was the next part of the story. Right now, in this moment, in this diner with the October light going amber through the window and the coffee cold and the ice beginning to melt in the towel against Dorothy's cheek, Right now, the important thing was simpler. Ruth hung up the phone. She turned and looked at Dorothy. She said, "They're sending someone. Real ones." Dorothy exhaled. Harold, who had not let go of her hand, squeezed it once. And outside, through the half-torn bell in the window with its fogged lower panes, Route 119 ran east and west between the mountains. Quiet in the midday, the leaves coming down in ones and twos in the October air. And somewhere down that road, a man named Conrad Decker was driving toward a future that had just changed its shape entirely, though he didn't know it yet. And somewhere farther down that road, the truth that had been building in that briefcase for years was about to stop being a private secret and start being a matter of public record. Dorothy touched the dog tags at her throat. Earl would have known, she thought. He would have stood up in that room. He never could stand by and watch. She'd always loved that about him and been terrified by it in equal measure, because standing up cost something every time, and she'd spent 40 years worrying that one day it would cost everything. She'd been right to worry. Beirut had proven her right. But she was still here. She was still sitting in the booth she always sat in, with the woman who had worked this counter for 20 years standing 10 feet away, and a man she'd never met who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by what he'd just done sitting across from her, finishing coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She was still here, and the papers were in her purse, and the house was on Cedar Fork Road, and none of that had changed. Not yet, not today. The bell over the door, half torn from its mount, gave a small, sad sound in the draft from the window, as if making a note. Cole finished his coffee. He set the cup down. He looked at Dorothy, and then at Ruth, and then at the door, and his expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic, adding up what has happened and what hasn't happened yet, and what will need to happen before the account is settled. He didn't say any of this. Men like Cole rarely said the things they were thinking when the things they were thinking were about what was coming. But Dorothy, who had been watching the faces of people who didn't say much for 40 years, saw it. She said to him, "There's more, isn't there?" He looked at her. "This isn't just about my house." He said no. He said it plainly, without apology or cushioning. "No, it's not." Dorothy looked at the briefcase. She thought of Garrett Flynn's pressed shirt, his patient smile, his folder full of forms. She thought about how practiced he'd been, how smooth, how completely routine it had all seemed. The way you are when you've done something many times. "How many people?" she said. Cole said, "That's what we're about to find out." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He set it on the table. He would make the call, but not yet. Not until the police came and the briefcase was secured and Dorothy was surrounded by people who weren't going anywhere. Ruth brought more coffee without being asked. The first police unit arrived 14 minutes after Ruth made the call, which was about 12 minutes faster than most people in the county had learned to expect. 2 officers, neither of them deputies, both wearing state police insignia, which told Cole something before either of them said a word. Ruth had not called the county sheriff. She had called the state. The officers, a woman named Strickland and a man named Hebert, came in and took in the scene in the methodical way of people trained to inventory quickly. 2 men sitting against the counter looking embarrassed and injured. Flynn in the booth with his wrist wrapped in kitchen towel and ice. A briefcase on the floor with papers visible through the sprung latch. Penny Slater with her phone already extended toward Officer Strickland. An old woman with a bruised face sitting between 2 older men who had clearly decided they were staying. Cole gave his statement standing, concise and sequential. He described what he had seen from the back booth and what he had done and why and in what order. He did not elaborate on training or background. He said he had intervened because the woman was being physically restrained against her will in a public space, and he had identified himself as present before engaging. Strickland wrote everything down without editorial comment. Hebert crouched by the briefcase and looked at it without touching it. He looked up at Cole. He said, "You know what you're looking at here?" Cole said, "I have a guess." Hebert said, "So do I." He got on his radio. The documents in the briefcase, once they were properly cataloged over the following 72 hours, would tell the full story of Conrad Decker and Ridgeline Partners with a clarity that depositions and testimony could only support. 11 separate property transfer agreements, each one signed in the same shaky hand of someone old and alone, each one containing the same concealed language that converted what looked like a medical assistance enrollment form into a binding deed transfer with a 30-day completion window. Some of the signatures had been obtained directly. Others showed signs of alteration so precise they had required a forensic document examiner to identify. 11 houses, 11 families who had been living in their homes for generations. 11 people who had trusted a man in a nice suit who came to the door and explained things in friendly, simple language, and then waited, patient as a trap, for the clock to run out. But that accounting came later. Right now in the diner, what mattered was that Officer Aber had gotten on his radio, and the quality of the response he was getting back suggested that the name Conrad Decker was not unknown to the people on the other end. Dorothy sat in her booth and answered questions when asked and was otherwise still in the way of someone who has been through a frightening thing and has now arrived at the stage past fear where everything becomes very quiet and clear. Ruth brought her a grilled cheese sandwich without asking. Dorothy ate it mechanically and then noticed she was eating it and seemed surprised. Cole sat in the back booth and waited. He had his phone in his hand. He had not made the call yet. He was waiting to understand the shape of things a little better before he moved the next piece. He had been a member of Iron Covenant MC for 19 years. He had been president for the last 4. The club had 34 members, all current or former military, scattered across Harlan County and the adjacent ridges, mechanics and electricians, and 1 retired nurse and 2 men who ran a small engine repair shop out of a garage on the Letcher County line. They were not an outlaw club in any operational sense. They did not traffic in anything except miles of road and the particular fellowship of men who had been through things that required no explanation among themselves. What they were, functionally, was 34 men who would get on their bikes and show up if Cole called. No questions until afterward. That was the covenant, the thing the name referred to, the agreement they had made with each other out on the ridge the night the club was chartered, that whatever else happened in their individual lives, none of them would be alone if the other 33 could help it. He had called them for funerals. He had called them when a member's house burned. He had called them twice for situations that had eventually required legal assistance, and once for a situation that had not. He had never called them for anything like this. He looked at Penny Slater across the room. She was talking to Strickland now, her son on her hip, explaining the recording with the specific calm of someone who had already decided that whatever it cost her to have done the right thing was worth paying. He looked at Dorothy, who was answering Habert's questions with the careful precision of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for 3 weeks without knowing it. Strickland came over to him after she'd finished with Penny. She sat down across the table, which meant she intended a longer conversation than the initial statement. "Mr. Weaver," she said. Cole said, "Officer?" She said, "You want to tell me about Iron Covenant." He looked at her. He said, "Club based out of Harlan County. 34 members, current and former military. We do charity rides and road assistance, and we show up when people need things carried or built." She said, "You don't get into business like this." He said, "Usually." She said, "But today you did." He said, "Today seemed like it needed it." Strickland looked at him for a moment. She had been a state police officer for 11 years, and she had a particular ability to look at a person and understand which category they belonged to, not always in the first 30 seconds, but usually by the end of a conversation. Cole Weaver, she was concluding, was not a complicated category. He was the kind of man who did what he thought was right and accepted the consequences and had very little interest in the approval or disapproval of anyone who hadn't been in the same room when it mattered. She said, "There may be more to this than the briefcase." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because a man like Decker doesn't get to 11 houses without help at multiple levels. He's got someone at the county recorder's office, or he'd have no way to confirm the transfers. He's got someone at the assessor's office, or the liens would have flagged months ago. And he had a deputy today, which means he had confidence that the law wouldn't interfere. You don't build that kind of confidence by accident." Strickland wrote something down. Cole said, the deputy who left, "You'll want his name on your list." She said, "Already is." He nodded. He looked at Dorothy, who had finished her sandwich and was sitting with both hands flat on the table, not trembling anymore, just present, looking at the window and the road outside and the mountains beyond. Cole said, "How long before this goes somewhere it can't be walked back?" Strickland said, "That depends on how deep it goes and who we can get to cooperate." He said, "The deputy." She said, "Possibly." He walked out. That's not the same as staying, but it's not the same as defiance either. It's someone who decided in the moment that he didn't want to be the thing he was being asked to be. That's something we can work with. Cole thought about that. He thought about the 20 people in this room who had seen everything and who would go home tonight and tell their families what they had seen. He thought about the young mother with the recording. He thought about Ruth, who had been watching things go wrong in this county for over a year, and who had chosen today to call the state police instead of the county sheriff. He thought about Dorothy going home to a house on Cedar Fork Road with a notice on the door that had no legal force anymore, but that still existed as a document and as a fact. He said to Strickland, "She goes home tonight." Strickland said, "Ms. Briggs isn't under any kind of restriction." He said, "I mean, she goes home and that house is hers and nobody goes near it. However, that needs to happen formally." Strickland said, "We'll have an officer make contact with the county recorder's office before end of business today. The transfer document will be flagged as under investigation. Nothing moves while it's flagged." Cole said, "Good." He stood up. He walked over to Dorothy. She looked up at him. She said, "Are you leaving?" He said, "Not yet. I need to make a phone call." She said, "Your people." He said, "My club. I want them to know what happened. I want some of them nearby for the next few days while this gets sorted, if that's all right with you." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it would mean to have 34 men show up on her behalf, men she didn't know, men on motorcycles with club patches on their backs, men who had come from the same world Earl had come from, the world of people who showed up when showing up was inconvenient. She said Earl was a Marine. Cole said, "I know." She said, "He always said the hardest thing about coming home was learning to let people help." Cole said, "That's about the truest thing I've heard in a long time." She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. "Make your call," she said. He stepped outside. The October air was cold in his lungs, good cold, the kind that told you where you were. The mountains were still there. The maple across the road had gone full copper in the afternoon light. His Harley sat in the parking lot, chrome gone dull, engine cool. He called Dax Holden first, because Dax was the vice president, and because Dax was the calmest person Cole had ever met, and would receive the information without drama, and would know who to call next. Cole told him everything in under 4 minutes, the way you tell it to men who don't need the emotional architecture, just the facts and the geography and the ask. Dax said, "How bad?" Cole said, "Bad enough that we'll be needed for a while, nothing violent. Presence, mostly. And I may need some of you at the courthouse when this comes to charges." Dax said, "When do you want people?" Cole said, "Tonight if anyone can, tomorrow morning for the rest." Dax said, "I'll make calls. You eat?" Cole said, "I had eggs." Dax said, "That was 6 hours ago." Cole said, "The eggs were good." He hung up. He stood in the parking lot for a moment and looked at the mountains and listened to the wind in the remaining leaves and thought about how many times he had stood in places that required something from him and how it never got easier and how that was probably correct. How the day it felt easy was probably the day you stopped understanding what it cost. He went back inside. Ruth was behind the counter. She had opened a bottle of decent bourbon that she kept for occasions, which was not a frequent occurrence at the Millstone, but which seemed applicable today, and she had poured 2 small glasses and set them on the counter. She pushed one toward Cole and looked at Dorothy, and Dorothy shook her head, but looked at it with an expression that suggested she understood the gesture. Cole sat on the stool at the counter. He picked up the glass and held it. He said to Ruth, "How long have you known about Decker?" Ruth said, "Known the way you know something you can prove? Today." Suspected the way you know something you feel in your stomach when certain people come through the door and certain other people stop coming? About a year. He said, the other people who signed." Ruth said, "I've seen 4 of them in here. 2 men and 2 women, all of them older than me. All of them came in looking the way Dorothy came in today. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know it was this." She looked at her glass and didn't drink it. She said, "I should have asked harder questions." Cole said, "You asked the right question today." She said, "I called the state police instead of the county." He said, "That was the right question." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Why did you sit in the back booth?" He said, "Force of habit." She said, "You always watch the door." He said, "Old habit from when it mattered." She said, "It mattered today." He said nothing to that. He drank his bourbon. It was better than the counter suggested. Across the room, Dorothy had taken out the dog tags and was holding them in her hand, not wearing them around her neck, just holding them in her palm, just having them be real and present. Earl's name on the metal, Earl Thomas Briggs, the way the Corps had stamped it, the way they stamped the names of all the men who went, and some of whom came back and some of whom didn't. She had a choice coming, and she was probably beginning to understand it. The next few weeks were going to require things from her that she hadn't had to provide in a long time. She would have to go to the courthouse and give depositions and sit across tables from lawyers and tell the same story more times than she would want to. She would have to deal with the county recorder's office and the state attorney's office and probably a federal agency or 2 before it was over, because Ridgeline Partners had a business structure that reached beyond one county's borders. and she would have to call Danny. She had been avoiding that, but she was going to have to do it. She put the tags back around her neck. She looked up and found Cole at the counter watching the room. She said from across the room, "Mr. Weaver?" He turned. She said, "My husband would have done exactly what you did today. He never could stand by and watch. He got in trouble his whole life over it." She paused. She was smiling, real and small and full of something that wasn't entirely sadness. "Best man I ever knew," she said. Cole looked at the tags at her throat. The worn metal of them, the name ground almost smooth by decades of being touched. He knew what those tags had cost. He knew what it meant to carry someone with you past the point where they could walk beside you. He said he raised good company to keep. She looked at him. He said, he'd be proud of you. Standing up in that room when it counted. Saying no when it mattered. Her eyes filled. She didn't cry. She just nodded and put one hand over the tags and held them. And that was enough. Outside, the sun was going lower against the mountains. And somewhere up Route 119 toward the county seat, a man named Conrad Decker was about to discover that the system he had spent 40 years building had just been handed to a different set of operators. The briefcase was in an evidence bag. The recording was on Penny Slater's phone. The copy of the contract was in Dorothy Briggs's purse. And the room that had been locked against all of them 2 hours ago was now open. Both doors, wind moving through it, the bell making its broken sound when the draft caught it. The investigation moved fast once it started, faster than Dorothy had expected, and faster than Decker's lawyers were prepared for. The state police worked through the weekend. By Monday morning, a forensic accountant from the Attorney General's office had been assigned to the case, and by Monday afternoon, she had identified 3 separate shell companies that sat between Conrad Decker and Ridgeline Partners, a structure designed to put distance between the man who ordered the scheme and the paperwork that executed it. It did not put enough distance. The signatures were the key. Dorothy's copy of her original contract turned out to be more valuable than she had understood when she'd made it at the post office machine. A document forensics examiner looked at both versions, the original she had preserved and the altered version that had appeared in Decker's briefcase, and wrote a 17-page report that used language like deliberate alteration and systematic substitution, and whose conclusions were, in plain terms, that someone had taken Dorothy's genuine signature from one document and reproduced it on another using a process that was both sophisticated and thoroughly documented by the evidence. It was not the only forged signature in the briefcase. It was not even the most egregious. But it was the one that came with a clean original for comparison, and that made it the clearest proof, the one a jury could understand without a graduate degree in document analysis. Dorothy learned all of this in a series of meetings at the state police post in the county seat that she drove to in the 10-year-old Buick with the dented quarter panel. She sat across tables from people who used words she had to ask about, and she asked about them, clearly and without embarrassment, because she had spent enough time in this county watching people get taken advantage of by language. They didn't understand that she was not going to let it happen again. The people across the table from her adjusted their language. That happened faster than she'd expected too. The forensic accountant's name was Marion Locke, and she was 41, and she had been doing this work long enough to have developed a reliable internal sense for when a case was a small crime and when it was the visible part of a large one. What she found in the financial records of Ridgeline Partners over the course of the next 6 days was firmly the second category. Decker had been operating in various forms and under various company names for 11 years. Ridgeline Partners was the 4th iteration. The previous 3 had been dissolved before investigators could focus on them, their records shredded or transferred offshore, their principals scattered, leaving behind a residue of confused elderly property owners who had signed things they hadn't understood and lost things they couldn't recover. The model was not original. Decker had learned it from someone, Marion Locke believed, though she couldn't yet prove who, and he had refined it over a decade into something efficient and largely invisible. The way it worked was as follows. The company would identify elderly property owners in economically stressed rural counties, specifically those with paid-off properties and fixed incomes and limited family presence. Decker's men would approach them in the guise of assistance programs, government representatives, medical benefit enrollment agents. They would spend time building trust before presenting documents. The documents were always complex and always contained the transfer language buried in sections that a trusting person signing in good faith would not be expected to scrutinize. Once the signature was obtained, the clock started. By the time most of the victims understood what had happened, the 30-day window had closed and the legal structure was in place. What Dorothy had done, in keeping a copy before returning the originals, had broken the mechanism. Her copy provided a before state that demonstrated the documents had been altered post-signature. Without that comparison, her word against Decker's would have been a harder fight. With it, there was physical evidence of the crime at a level of specificity that made the forensic examination straightforward. On Tuesday morning, she called Danny. She sat at the kitchen table with the phone and Sergeant asleep across her feet, and the service flag on the shelf above the fireplace, and she dialed the number she'd had memorized for 30 years, and which she rarely used because using it required accepting a version of their relationship that still made her tired. Danny answered on the third ring. He sounded surprised, and then, when she told him what had happened, he sounded something else, something she hadn't heard from him since he was 12 years old and had come home to find out his dog had died. He sounded young. He said, "Why didn't you call me when this started?" She said, "Because I thought I could handle it." He said, "Mom." She said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you need me to come?" She thought about that. She thought about what it would mean for him to make the drive from Portland, to take the time, to sit in this kitchen that still had scuff marks at knee height on the hallway wall. She thought about how long she had been managing the distance between them with a kind of careful maintenance that had kept the relationship intact at the cost of keeping it shallow. She said, "Yes, if you can." He said, "I'll get a flight." There was a silence that was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have been operating in a particular pattern for long enough that changing the pattern is felt as a physical thing, a change in pressure. She said, "The house is fine, nobody's taking it." He said, "I know, that's not why I'm coming." She did not say anything to that. She put her hand over Earl's tags. She said, "All right then." Iron Covenant arrived Wednesday evening. Not all 34 of them at once, which Dorothy had half feared, imagining a convoy filling Cedar Fork Road with engine noise and leather and chrome. Instead, they came in small groups over the course of the afternoon and evening. Some pairs, some singles, parking down the road from the house at Cole's direction and walking up. They knocked at the door. They introduced themselves. They were, to a man, quiet and careful in the way of people who have been told to mind themselves, and she understood that Cole had told them. Cole was already there by the time the first of them arrived. He had come that morning and walked around the house and the property with the thoroughness of a man inspecting a perimeter, which was what he was doing. He had not said much about his findings, but he had made a call that afternoon, and that evening, a locksmith came and replaced the locks on both doors with something considerably more substantial. Cole paid for it. Dorothy didn't argue. The men who came did not crowd the house. Most of them sat on the porch or in the yard or in vehicles on the road, talking among themselves in the low voice of people who are comfortable in extended waiting. A man named Cody Fletcher, who in daylight hours ran an electrician business out of a van with a ladder rack, fixed the porch light that had been out since August. He didn't make a production of it. He just got his tools and did it. A man named Seth Roth, who was 26 and the youngest member of the club, sat on the porch steps for 2 hours and played a harmonica with the kind of unself-conscious focus of someone who is playing for themselves and would be doing it whether anyone was listening or not. Dorothy brought out coffee and then had to be told, gently by Cole, that there were too many of them for that to be practical and she should sit down. She sat on the porch with him in the cold evening air, and they drank coffee and looked at the maple tree and didn't talk much because it turned out some things didn't need talking. She said after a while, "You do this a lot." He said, "Show up?" She said, "This. Whatever this is." He thought about that. He said, "When somebody needs it." She said, "Who needed you once?" "You said somebody stood up for you once when you couldn't do it yourself." He looked at the mountains. He said, "Man named Walter Pierce, 19 years ago. I was having a bad stretch after I came back from my second tour, and I was handling it badly, and Walter was my shop foreman at the time, and he could have let me go and would have been within his rights to. Instead, he called me into his office and he said, 'I'm going to say this once, and then we're going to go back to work. Whatever you carried home, it doesn't define you and it doesn't have to win. But you have to decide it doesn't. And you have to let people help.'" He paused. He said, "I told him I didn't need help." Dorothy said, "He told you that was wrong." Cole said, "He said I wasn't the best judge of that right then. And then he went and found me someone to talk to, and he checked in every week for a year without making it seem like checking in." He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "Walter died in 2018. Heart. I was a pallbearer." Dorothy said, "He sounds like Earl." Cole said, I think they'd have recognized each other. She said, the good ones always do. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were visible between the ridges. Sargent had escaped the house somehow and was sitting on the porch railing with the dignity of a cat who has decided to permit everyone's presence. Cole looked at the cat, and the cat looked at him with the particular evaluation that cats use, and then turned away, which was probably a positive sign. One of the men down by the road had a guitar and was playing something quiet. Not a song Dorothy recognized, just an arrangement of notes that seemed right for the temperature and the hour. She could hear it from the porch. She let herself listen. She had not been unafraid in her own house at night since she could remember, but she had been afraid differently. The fear she'd carried for the past 3 weeks, of the knock at the door, of the truck across the road, of the legal language she didn't understand wrapped around the things she'd built with Earl. That specific fear was gone now. She was tired and she was sad in the way of someone who has been reminded that the world requires things from you that you didn't necessarily sign up for. But she was not afraid. She said to Cole, what happens to the other people? The other 11. He said, same process you've been through. State will contact each of them. Strickland told me they've already located 7. She said, do they know yet? That it's being addressed. He said, some of them. She said, who's going to tell the ones who don't know? Cole looked at her. He said, that might be something you could do. Later. When you have the energy. If you wanted. Dorothy thought about being the person who called a stranger and told them that what had happened to them was happening to someone else too, and that someone was fighting it, and that they weren't alone in it. She thought about what it would have felt like to receive that call 3 weeks ago, before she'd found the notice on the door, when she'd been in the kitchen with Flynn and his forms, and no framework at all for understanding what was happening. She said, yes, I'll do that. She said it simply, the way you commit to a thing you understand will be hard, but which is clearly the right thing to do. Danny came Thursday. He arrived in a rental car at 2 in the afternoon, a man in his late 40s who had his father's coloring and his mother's eyes, and who stood in the driveway looking at the house for a moment before he came up the porch steps, taking in the maple and the porch railing that Cody Fletcher had repaired, and the new locks and the motorcycle parked at the end of the drive. Dorothy came out and met him on the steps, and he put his arms around her and held on, and she held on back, and it was the first time since she couldn't remember that she'd let someone hold her that way without managing it, without being careful about how much she let them feel the weight of her. He said into her hair, I'm sorry I wasn't here. She said, you're here now. He pulled back and looked at her face, at the bruise that was going yellow at the edges now, healing. He looked at the motorcycle at the end of the drive. He said, is that the man who helped you? She said, that's his bike, he's inside. Danny looked at the motorcycle for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating several assumptions simultaneously. Then he said, what's his name? Dorothy said, Cole Weaver. And he didn't help me. He stood beside me while I helped myself. Danny looked at her. She put her arm through his arm and walked him up the porch steps and into the house that was still theirs, that had been theirs since before he was born. That was going to stay theirs. Inside, Cole was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the papers spread out that the state police had sent, the ones Dorothy needed to review and sign, the formal documentation of what was being undone. He looked up when they came in. He stood. Danny said, are you Cole? Cole said, that's right. Danny looked at him for a moment. Then he put out his hand. He said, thank you for standing up for my mother. Cole shook his hand. He said, she was already standing. I just kept her company. Danny looked at his mother. She looked back with the expression she had been wearing since Wednesday evening, the one that had replaced the fear, the one that was going to take some time to fully name. She went to the stove. She said, I'll explain everything. But first, coffee. Through the kitchen window, the maple was copper against the gray sky. The mountains were where they had always been. Sargent appeared from wherever he'd been and took up his position on the kitchen counter, which he knew was not permitted, and looked at Dorothy with the expression of an animal who has calculated the odds of enforcement and found them favorable. She let him stay. It was a good afternoon. Earl would have let him stay too. By the time the charging documents were filed, all 11 of the other victims had made contact with the state attorney's office. Dorothy had called every one of them. Cole had helped her prepare. They had sat at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, Danny still in town, and Cole had helped her think through what to say. He said, tell them the most important thing first, that someone is helping them now. They don't need the full story right away. They just need to know they're not alone. She had called all 11. Some of them cried. Some of them went very quiet. One man, a retired farmer named Russell Carver, whose property was in the next county, had gone so silent after she explained who she was and what had happened that she thought the call had dropped. And then he said, in a voice almost too low to hear, "I thought I did it to myself. I thought it was my own fault." She said, "No, you were taken advantage of by someone who was very practiced at it. That is not the same thing as your fault." He said, "I haven't told my son." She said, "I hadn't told my son either. I called him eventually. It helped." He said, "It doesn't feel like something a man wants to admit." She said, "I know, but you didn't do anything wrong. You trusted a stranger who turned out to be the kind of person who preys on trust. The fault is entirely his." She could hear him breathing on the other end. She said, "We're getting it back. The state is working on everyone's property. The transfers are being unwound. Your farm should be restored to your name." He said, "I can't believe that." She said, "It's happening. It's already happening for mine." She could hear him trying to decide whether to believe it. She let him take his time. She had learned, making these calls, that the most important thing you could give people was time. Not rushing them toward the conclusion that things were going to be all right, because they were used to being rushed and they were used to the conclusion being wrong. Just staying on the line, staying present. Russell Carver called his son that night. Dorothy knew this because his son called her the next morning, and his voice was a mixture of fury and relief and something else. Something she recognized as gratitude that had not yet found its final form. He said, "I want to thank you. I don't know how to do that properly yet. I'm still pretty angry at the people who did this." She said, "That's a reasonable order of operations." He laughed. She liked his laugh. By November, the county letter arrived. Dorothy read it at the kitchen table with her coffee and Sergeant asleep across her feet. The letter from the county recorder's office confirmed that the transfer document had been voided, that the deed to the property at Cedar Fork Road was in her name, as it had been since she and Earl had signed it in 1983, and that no encumbrance existed. She read it twice. She set it on the table next to her coffee. She fed Sergeant his morning meal. She went out to the porch and looked at the maple, which had given up its last leaves and was standing bare and black against the gray November sky, in the way of the maples in this county, patient and permanent. She went back inside. She picked up the phone. She called Cole. He answered on the second ring. She said, "It came, the letter." He said, "Good." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You did the hard part." She said, "We both know that's not true." He said nothing to that for a moment. Then he said, "You called all 11 of them." She said, "Yes." He said, "That was the hard part." She thought about Russell Carver's voice. She thought about the old woman 2 counties over who had wept so hard. Dorothy had sat with the phone pressed against her ear for 20 minutes without saying anything, just breathing, just being there. She thought about the 7 of them who now had lawyers. She said, "Maybe we both did hard parts." He said, "That's a reasonable conclusion." She said, "Will you come to Thanksgiving?" He was quiet for a moment. She said, "Ruth's coming, and Harold and James from the diner. Danny and Christine, I'd like you there." Cole said, "I'll come." She said, "Bring Dax if he doesn't have somewhere to be." Cole said, "I'll ask him." She set the letter from the county recorder's office on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the flag case. She looked at them together, the formal triangle of folded fabric and the official letter on county stationery, and she thought about what it meant to build a record, to make things that lasted, to insist on your presence in the world even when the world put pressure against it. Earl had done that. He had built a life and a home and a family in a county that didn't always make it easy, and he had held on to it with both hands until Beirut. And after that, she had held on to it for him for 40 years, not just holding on, but building. One canned jar and one repaired floorboard and one Friday at the millstone at a time. No one was going to take that. She understood that now in a way she hadn't understood it before. Not as a hope or a wish, but as a fact. The trial took 8 months. That was the part no one had told her to expect. The length of it, the way it stretched. There were preliminary hearings and continuances and motions she didn't understand, and a period in which it seemed like nothing was happening at all. Dorothy wrote everything down. She had gone through 2 notebooks by March. Conrad Decker had attempted twice to plead to reduce charges, and both times the state had declined, because the federal component of the case required a full accounting, and because the state attorney had a witness list she was not willing to compress. Decker had a business structure that reached beyond Harlan County. Several of the transferred properties had mineral rights connected to an interstate energy deal, which had brought in federal investigators by December. The scope of what the briefcase had opened kept expanding. reaching into counties Dorothy had never been to, into records that predated Ridgeline Partners, all the way back through the previous company names to the beginning of a scheme that had been running for 11 years. She went to the Millstone every Friday. She and Ruth had their tea and their lunch and their conversation. And Ruth kept her informed of things that never made it into official briefings, the texture of the county's response to the charges, who was surprised and who wasn't. Ruth said she'd been making calls herself since October, calls she should have made sooner, and that she'd started leaving a small laminated card on every table at the Millstone with the number for the county legal aid office. Several people had called it. Ruth did not know what happened in those calls. It was not her business what happened in those calls. She just wanted the number to exist on the table in case someone needed it. Cole came by the house on Cedar Fork Road once in a while, not regularly, not in a way that suggested a schedule, just when the road brought him past, which Dorothy suspected was more intentional than the phrasing implied. He would knock, have coffee, stay an hour or two. They would talk about whatever there was to talk about, which turned out to be a range of things wider than she had expected. He had opinions about the novels she was reading. She had opinions about the county's road maintenance priorities that amused him. Once they spent an entire afternoon looking at old photographs she had never organized, photos of Earl before the Corps and after, photos of Danny at various ages, photos of the house in different decades. Cole looked at each one carefully and asked questions, and she told him things she had not said out loud in years. Spring came. The maple in the front yard budded early, and Dorothy watched it from the porch with her morning coffee and thought about time, about how much of what she had been afraid of losing was actually still here, still present, more present now that she had been reminded that it could be lost. The house was not just a structure, it was a record. But she was beginning to understand now that it was also a place where the future could happen, and that was different from what she'd thought it was when the fear was highest. Danny and Christine came for Easter. The kitchen was full of people. The scuff marks on the hallway wall at knee height were still there, and always would be. She planted the kitchen garden earlier than usual that spring because the ground was ready and she wanted to. She planted more than usual. She had people to feed now. She had Ruth and Harold and James on irregular Fridays. She had Russell Carver and his son coming in June. The son had called to see if he could come by, just to see the house, just to understand what his father had been fighting for. And she had said yes, bring your father. In August, the trial date arrived. The courthouse in the county seat was a building constructed in 1912 that had undergone 3 expansions since then, each of which had added something without quite cohering with what was already there. Dorothy had been in it exactly twice before in her life, and both times she'd found it somewhat oppressive. The day of Conrad Decker's trial, she drove herself to the county seat. She parked in the lot off Main Street and sat in the Buick for a few minutes looking at the building. Then she got out. Cole was waiting on the courthouse steps. Behind him were 26 members of Iron Covenant MC, standing in loose groups on either side of the entrance, not blocking it, not demonstrating, just present. They wore their cuts. They were quiet and still. Some of them had been there since 7 in the morning. They had not been asked to come for any tactical reason. There was nothing tactical they could do in a courtroom. They had come because Cole had mentioned the date and the time, and they had showed up. That was the covenant. You said where and when, and they came. She walked up the steps, and Cole fell in beside her. She said, "You didn't need to do this." He said, "Correct." She said, "I'm glad you're here." He said, "Me too." Inside, the courtroom was already half full. Officer Strickland was there, off duty but present. Penny Slater was in the 3rd row with her mother, who had driven 4 hours. Ruth Gallagher sat in the 2nd row with her reading glasses and a notebook. Harold and James were in the back row, Harold in a suit jacket that was slightly too large in the way of a suit jacket kept for occasions. Russell Carver was there. He had driven from the next county, and his son had come with him, and they sat together in the middle of the gallery, looking like what they were. 2 men of different generations who had arrived at an understanding of each other through an event neither of them would have chosen. 6 of the other 11 victims were present. 3 had been unable to come for reasons of health or distance. But when Dorothy walked in and the people who knew her turned, there was a moment of acknowledgement that she felt in her chest. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just a room full of people who had each been through something alone and were now in it together. Decker came in with his lawyers, 3 of them, and he looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. He had always occupied space with the confidence of men who are accustomed to being the largest presence in a room. But the room was no longer organized to receive him that way. Without the locked door and the bought deputy and the system to fall back on, he was just an old man in a good suit facing a long sequence of bad mornings. He did not look at Dorothy when he passed. The arraignment had been procedurally unexciting. The trial was different. It took 12 days. The jury deliberated for 2. On the day the foreman read the first guilty verdict, the gallery made no noise because the decorum of the courthouse required it, and Dorothy made no noise either. But she felt something, a release, a pressure differential, like the change in a room when a window that has been stuck finally opens and the air moves. She looked at Cole in the row behind her. He was looking at the jury box with the expression of a man who has learned to wait without investing and who has therefore not been disappointed. She looked at Russell Carver and his son. She looked at Penny Slater, who had her phone in her hand and was typing something to someone with the particular speed of a person delivering news. She looked at Ruth, who was writing in her notebook. Conrad Decker was convicted on 9 of the 11 charges, including the 3 federal ones. His 2 primary associates received sentences of their own. The deputy, Ray Holden, had cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges after calling the state police on a Sunday night 2 weeks after the diner, and lost his badge and pension and would spend years explaining in careful detail exactly how the scheme had worked. Garrett Flynn received a sentence that was reduced after he posted bond, and then violated the terms of his bond by leaving the state, which added charges, and the last Dorothy heard he was serving a consolidated sentence in a federal facility in Ohio, which she considered reasonable. All 11 properties were restored to their owners. Every deed transfer was voided. Every forged signature was documented and discredited. The machine that had been running for 11 years, through 4 company names, across multiple counties, was disassembled piece by piece until there was nothing left of it but a court record and the memories of the people who had lived through it. Outside afterward, on the courthouse steps in the August heat, Dorothy stood in the sun and let the warmth come down on her face and thought of nothing for a long moment. Just the sun, just the air, just the solid fact of being present in the world and having the house on Cedar Fork Road waiting at the end of the drive. Cole came and stood beside her. She said, "It's over." He said, "This part." She said, "What's the next part?" He said, "Living the regular life." She said, "I used to know how to do that." He said, "You still do. You did it for 40 years. She said, "Alone." He said, "Well," he paused, "some things change." She looked at him. He was looking at the street in the way he looked at things when he was being careful about something, the specific stillness of a man who has decided to say something true and is giving it room. She said, "Some things do." Let me tell you what happened to the millstone after that October Friday. Ruth Gallagher had been running that diner since 2003 when her husband passed, and she'd taken it over because she had 3 kids in school and a building she owned outright, and a choice between making something of it or not making something of it. She had chosen the former and had not stopped choosing it since. 22 years of bad coffee and perfect eggs and a counter she'd restained twice, and a jukebox nobody used, and a booth in the corner where the light came in right in the morning if you angled yourself correctly. After October, after the state police and the briefcase, things changed in ways Ruth had not anticipated. The story got out the way stories get out in small counties, which is to say completely and without much regard for who had wanted it kept quiet. People came in who had not been in before, just to see the place, to sit in the booths, to drink the bad coffee and look at the counter where the deputy had set down his badge and the floor where the briefcase had hit. Ruth found this somewhat undignified and also quietly touching, and decided to treat it as neither and just serve people their food. A young woman from the county paper wrote a story that was picked up by the state wire services and eventually by a few national outlets because the elements of it contained a particular combination that readers found resonant. Elderly widow, forged documents, biker club, locked diner, young mother with phone. The photograph she took on the courthouse steps in August ran with 2 of the national pieces. Ruth made 1 copy and taped it to the wall behind the register, which was the only wall decoration in the place apart from a county fair calendar and an ancient photograph of the building from 1962. She did not change the menu or the decor or the hours. She repaired the bell over the door properly in November. She did not replace it with anything fancier. She was behind the counter the first Friday in September. After the verdict, when Dorothy came in for their usual lunch, and she came around the counter before Dorothy sat down and put her arms around her and held on for a moment without saying anything. Dorothy held on back. When they let go, they were both occupied with looking in other directions for a few seconds. Ruth poured the tea. She sat down across from Dorothy in the corner booth, which she almost never did during open hours. She said, "I have to tell you something." Dorothy looked at her. Ruth said, "I looked the other way too many times. Before you came in that Friday, I saw things over the years, people coming in scared with men like Flynn hovering over them, and I didn't ask hard enough questions. I told myself it wasn't my place." Dorothy said, "You called the state police." Ruth said, "At the end, when it was right in front of me and I had no excuse not to." Dorothy said, "That was the call that mattered." Ruth said, "I should have made it earlier, for some of the others." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, probably. And you'll make it earlier next time." Ruth looked at her. She said, "That's a very practical response." Dorothy said, "I spent 40 years being angry at myself for things that were done to me and things I did and things I didn't do. It got me nothing useful. I prefer to spend what I have left differently." Ruth looked at the photograph behind the register, the courthouse steps, the leather cuts, the August light. She said, "You look different in that photograph than you looked when you walked in here in October." Dorothy said, "I am different." Ruth said, "In what way?" Dorothy thought about it. She said, "Less afraid." Not unafraid, less. There's a difference. Unafraid is for people who haven't paid attention. Less afraid is for people who have paid attention and decided it's not going to stop them. Ruth poured more tea. She said, "That's a distinction worth keeping." Dorothy agreed. Penny Slater, who had held her phone face down on the table in the millstone on that October Friday, became something of a person people knew about in the county. Not famous in any way she wanted or sought, but known. The way a person becomes known when they've done a thing that other people wanted to do and couldn't, and word of it travels. She was working at the county library by the following spring, a job that suited her, and that she had gotten in part because the woman who ran the library had been looking for someone with the particular kind of nerve that Penny had demonstrated, which was the nerve to do the right thing in a room full of people doing nothing. Penny had called Dorothy once, a few months after the diner, to ask how she was doing. Dorothy had asked how she was doing. They had talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the diner and everything to do with what people carry after events like that. The ways it changes you and the ways you worry it has changed you wrong. Penny had a particular anxiety that she had not done enough, that if she had stood up sooner, things would have been different. Dorothy had told her that the recording, the act of holding up that phone, had been the thing that broke the whole scheme open. That without it, the verbal evidence would have been softer, harder to prosecute, easier for Decker's lawyers to blur at the edges. Penny had said, "I was scared." Dorothy had said, "I know. You did it anyway. That's what the word means." They had lunch once in the millstone in the spring, Penny with her son who was now 3, and had strong opinions about the ketchup. Ruth had come out from behind the counter for 10 minutes to sit with them. It had been a noisy, warm half hour that Dorothy wrote about in her notebook that evening, trying to capture the quality of it, the specific pleasure of 3 women who had been through a thing together sitting in ordinary sunlight with bad coffee and ketchup opinions. Harold and James from the middle booth had, it turned out, known about Decker for about 2 years. James, who had been the county assessor's office clerk until his retirement 8 years prior, had watched certain anomalies in the records with a suspicion he had not known how to act on. After the diner, after the investigation, he had spent 3 afternoons in the state attorney's office providing context for the financial records that Marion Locke was working through. Context that had turned out to be valuable in tracing the history of the scheme through its earlier iterations. Harold, who was the better cook, had started bringing food to Dorothy's on a semi-regular basis. Not because she needed feeding, but because he was the kind of man who expressed care through provision and had not had many people to provide for since his wife had passed 4 years prior. Dorothy accepted this in the spirit it was offered and reciprocated with her tomatoes and apple butter, which Harold had strong opinions about and which she found flattering. The two of them, Harold and James, came to the millstone on Tuesdays now, as well as their regular days, and on Tuesdays they generally ended up at the counter talking to Ruth, and Ruth found that she appreciated their company more than she would have predicted, which was information she had been absorbing slowly over the winter. But I want to tell you what happened to some of the larger things too, because the story didn't end with the verdict. The verdict was a point on a line, and the line kept going, and what happened along it mattered. Marion Locke's report to the federal investigators opened a second investigation in a neighboring state connected to one of Decker's earlier company iterations and a property scheme that had been operating there before he'd moved it to Kentucky. That investigation identified 7 additional victims, all of them in the same demographic, all of them elderly and isolated and in possession of paid-off rural properties. By the time that case reached its own resolution, nearly 2 years after the Friday in the Millstone, 23 people in 3 states had their properties restored. None of them would ever have known to fight back if a woman in Harlan County hadn't walked into a diner on a Friday with her copies in her purse. Dorothy thought about that sometimes. She thought about the morning she'd found the notice on the door, about the cold that had gone through her, about sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out who to call. She thought about how close she'd come to simply giving in, accepting the legal language she couldn't read as the final word, because that was what people in her position had learned to do when institutions turned against them. You didn't fight, you couldn't afford to fight. You accepted the loss and you kept living. What had changed it was smaller than you would think. Ruth saying years before any of this, to always keep a copy. The habit of walking into the Millstone on a Friday. The dog tags around her neck that made a man in the back booth notice something worth noticing. The decision to say no out loud when no one else was saying it. Small things, each one insufficient by itself. Together everything. Cole called her the night before she was scheduled to give the deposition that would be used in the related federal case, the one that came almost a year after Decker's conviction. He said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Like myself." He said, "That's the right answer." She said, "I'm not nervous." He said, "I know. You've been ready for this since that Friday in October." She said, "You think so?" He said, "You kept the copies. You walked into that diner instead of staying home. You said no. 3 times you said no when most people would have given up. You were ready before any of the rest of this happened. The rest of it was just confirmation." She held the phone and thought about that. She said, "You're staying." He said, "For as long as it takes." She said, "Good." She said, "Earl's been quiet lately. Not that he talks, but sometimes I can feel whether he's at peace with something or not. I've been able to feel it for 40 years. He's at peace with this." Cole said, "He should be." She said, "He's at peace with you. That matters to me, that he would recognize you." Cole said, "Thank you." She said, "Good night, Mr. Weaver." He said, "Good night, Mrs. Briggs." She set the phone down. She went to the shelf above the fireplace and looked at the flag case and the letter from the county recorder's office and the photograph from the courthouse steps in August, all 3 of them in a row, the record of what had happened and what it held. Earl's name was on the tags at her throat. She was wearing them outside her shirt these days, which was new, which was something she had done without entirely deciding to, which felt right. She thought about the woman who had walked into the Millstone on that October Friday. The woman with the bruised cheek and the shaking hands and the heavy purse with the papers in it. The woman who had been carrying the fear for 3 weeks without knowing who to tell. She thought about that woman with something that was not quite pity, because pity condescended to her own past self, and more like recognition. The recognition of someone who has been somewhere difficult and has enough distance now to see it clearly. That woman had done 2 things right. She had kept the copies, and she had walked through the door. Everything else had followed from those 2 things. A motorcycle came down Cedar Fork Road on a morning in late September, a year and a few weeks after the October that had changed things. Black chrome gone dull for miles. It slowed at the end of Dorothy's drive and turned in and came up and stopped. Cole got off and came up the porch steps. He said, "Morning." She said, "You're early." He said, "I had a start." She went inside and came back with a second coffee. He sat in the chair she'd brought out for that purpose in the spring, the one that had been in the back bedroom since she couldn't remember, and that she'd repainted with paint left over from the kitchen. They sat with their coffees. Sargent regarded Cole from the railing with the expression of a cat who has decided, after a year of consideration, that this particular human is acceptable. Dorothy said, "Russell's coming in June, with his son. I told him you'd probably be around." Cole said, "I'll be around." She said, "He wants to talk to you about his service. He did 2 tours before I was born. He doesn't talk about it much. His son wants to understand." Cole said, "That's a conversation worth having." She said, "I told him you'd say that." Cole said, "You're getting ahead of me." She said, "Earl used to complain about that too." He looked at the mountains. He said, "Earl sounds like a man who managed somehow." She said, "He managed very well. He just had to keep up is all." Cole made that sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. The morning was quiet. The mountains were the same shape they had always been. The maple was going copper on schedule. Sargent settled his tail around his paws on the railing with the contentment of a creature who has decided the morning is satisfactory. Dorothy said, I've been thinking about what you said after the verdict, about the next part being the regular life. He said, and? She said, I think I've been living it. I think it started that Friday and I didn't notice it start. Because regular life doesn't announce itself. It just begins. Cole looked at her. He said, that sounds right to me. She said, Earl always said the best mornings were the ones where nothing in particular happened. You just got up and had your coffee and were glad to be there. Cole said, smart man. She said he had his moments. She held her coffee cup with both hands the way she held everything now, with the specific attention of someone who has been reminded what it means to hold a thing. The October light came down on the porch, in the mountain, and the maple, and the old road. They sat with their coffees and the morning held around them, warm and quiet and entirely ordinary, which was the best thing it could have been. There's something I've been trying to say for a while now, and I want to say it plainly before we reach the end of this. The machine that Conrad Decker ran for 11 years was not unique to him. It was not unique to Kentucky. It was not unique to that decade. Schemes like it exist wherever there are old people living alone in paid-off houses and clever men willing to dress in nice suits and speak in friendly language and slide paperwork across kitchen tables. They exist because isolation is a condition, and because the law in its written form can be made to say things that the law in its spirit would never permit, and because people who have lived their whole lives trusting the institutions around them often cannot imagine that those institutions can be purchased. What stopped Decker was not the law, which had been partly purchased. It was not institutional intervention, which came after the fact. It was three things in order. A woman who kept a copy. A man who stood up. A young mother who held up her phone. None of them were heroes in the way that word usually gets used. They were just people who did not look away when looking away was available and tempting. Dorothy because she was angry enough, and because Ruth had told her to keep copies years before. Cole because he'd seen enough of the world to understand that the moment you look away is the moment the damage becomes permanent. Penny because she had a child on her lap and a phone in her hand and something in her that decided the record was worth keeping. You cannot predict which person in a room will be the one who moves first. You cannot know in advance whether it will be you. What you can know is that rooms like that one exist, that there are moments where the weight of what's happening tips against looking away, and that when those moments come, the whole shape of what follows depends on which choice gets made first. In the Millstone Diner on Route 119 in Harlan County, on a Friday in October, the right choice got made first. Everything else flowed from that. Dorothy Briggs stayed in the house on Cedar Fork Road. She kept her kitchen garden. She kept her Friday lunches at the Millstone. She kept writing in her notebooks. She kept calling the people who had been through what she'd been through, not just the 11 from the briefcase, but others she heard about through the legal aid office, and through the state attorney's office, and through Ruth's network, which was more extensive than anyone who didn't know Ruth well would have guessed. She became a person who knew what to say to someone who had been robbed by a piece of paper, which was that they were not alone, and that it was not their fault, and that people were fighting for them right now. She became a person who made those calls with the patience and the steadiness of someone who had been on the other end of the silence and knew what it felt like to be waiting for someone to stay on the line. Cole stayed in Harlan County. He continued to ride. He continued to run Iron Covenant, which by the following spring had 41 members, 7 more than when the October in the diner had happened, because word of what the club had done spread through the county in the way that the true things spread, quietly and accurately, and men who had been thinking about joining found a reason to. He came to Cedar Fork Road when the road brought him that way, which was regularly. He became a fixture of the Friday lunches, not every week, but enough that Ruth had a standing order for him, black coffee and eggs and wheat toast, which she put in without asking when she saw the black Harley in the parking lot. He and Dorothy talked about many things in the years after. They talked about Earl and about Walter Pierce and about the ways that the people you lose continue to shape the choices you make long after you can no longer ask them what they think. They talked about the county and about what it meant to stay in a place when staying was a choice rather than a default. They talked about the regular life and what it asked of you and what it gave back. One afternoon in the spring of the second year, sitting on the porch at Cedar Fork Road with the new leaves on the maple and Sergeant investigating something at the base of the steps, Dorothy said to Cole, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly. He said, all right. She said, when you stood up that Friday in the diner, when you set down your coffee and came out from behind that table, was any part of it about me? Not just about what was right, about me specifically. Cole looked at the maple for a moment. He said, I saw the dog tags. She said, I know. You've said that. He said, I know what those tags cost. I know what it means to wear someone that close for that long. I know what it means to be a person who does that and doesn't break under the weight of it and keeps going every morning. He paused. So yes, it was about what was right. And it was also about you specifically. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She touched Earl's tags at her throat. She said, he would have liked you saying that. Cole said, would you? She said, I think I already told you he'd be proud of me. Cole said, you told me what Earl would think. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the maple and catching on the copper of the new leaves and the chrome of the Harley at the end of the drive, and the mountains were the same shape they had been forever, patient and indifferent and beautiful in the way of things that have no need of approval. She said, yes, I would. They sat with their coffees and the afternoon held around them, and the house held its shape behind them, and the record stood. There's one more thing I want to tell you about, one more piece of the afternoon in the millstone that I haven't fully explained yet, because it is the piece that took me the longest to understand. When Decker walked into that diner and locked the door and turned the sign to closed, he did something he'd probably done before in some form or another. He took a public space and made it private. He took a room full of people who had their own lives and their own concerns and their own good reasons to mind their business, and he made them into hostages, witnesses, participants in something they hadn't chosen. He did this because it had worked before. It worked because people in rooms like that tend to make the same calculation, which is that intervening costs something and not intervening costs nothing. The person being hurt pays. Everyone else keeps their coffee warm and their morning intact and goes home with their hands clean. What Decker didn't account for was that the calculation changes when one person makes a different choice. Not dramatically, not all at once, but it changes. The moment Cole stood up, every person in that room had to recalculate. Because now the cost of not intervening included watching a man they were sharing a room with do the thing they couldn't do. And that's a different kind of cost. That one comes home with you. That one keeps you up at night. Courage is contagious. That is not a sentiment. That is a mechanism. It works by changing the arithmetic of the people around it, by demonstrating that standing up is survivable, by removing from the equation the uncertainty of being first. Cole was first. After Cole, Penny could raise her phone. After Penny raised her phone and held it steady, the room understood that the evidence was being made, that the truth had a record now, that there was something to protect by staying. After the deputy set down his badge and walked out, Decker had nothing left. Not because the deputy was brave, because he wasn't particularly, but because even cowardice, when it makes the right choice, changes the shape of what's possible. And after the room turned, Ruth had her phone and the right number to call. And after Ruth made the call, the state police came. And after the state police came, the briefcase was opened. And after the briefcase was opened, Marion Locke sat down with the financials. And after Marion Locke did her work, 23 people across 3 states got their land back. All of it traceable to one man setting down his coffee. That is what I want you to carry out of this, if you carry anything. Not the fights, not the verdict, not the machinery of justice that did eventually work, slowly and imperfectly, but really, which is more than it sometimes does. I want you to carry the mechanism, the way one person choosing not to look away changes what's possible for everyone in the room. Because you will be in rooms like that one. Maybe not with a locked door and bought badges and a man in a gray suit. Maybe quieter rooms, smaller stakes. A meeting where something wrong is being done and everyone is being very careful not to notice. A conversation where someone is being diminished and the people around them are studying their shoes. A situation where the cost of speaking up is real and the cost of silence is being paid by someone else. In those rooms, the question is whether you will be Cole or whether you will be one of the people with their coffee halfway to their mouths. You will have a reason not to act. You will always have a reason not to act. The reason will be real and it will feel sufficient and it will probably be something you've told yourself before. What Cole had was simpler than a reason. He had already decided, before he needed to decide, that he was not the kind of man who looked away. He had made that decision years before, in a series of rooms that cost him things he didn't fully describe, and he had kept making it until it was no longer a decision so much as a fact about who he was. That is available to you. It is not easy. It is not free. It requires practice, and the practice sometimes hurts. And the first time is the hardest. And after the first time, it is still hard, but it is less uncertain because you know you're capable of it. Dorothy Briggs had made a version of that decision herself, in her kitchen, before she drove to the millstone. She had not known what she was deciding. She had just picked up her purse with the papers in it and got into the Buick and driven Route 119 with the window cracked, smelling wood smoke from somewhere up the hollow, deciding that she was not going to let this happen quietly. That was her version of setting down the coffee. You make that choice, and you don't know what comes after. You don't know if there will be a coal in the back booth. You don't know if there will be a Penny with her phone. You don't know if the real police will come or if the ones who come will be bought. You don't know if it will work. What you know is what it costs to not make it, which is the kind of knowledge that lives in you quietly for the rest of your life, surfacing on the nights when everything is still and you have nothing to distract you from the accounting. Dorothy Briggs slept well after that October. She hadn't expected to, given everything that was still unresolved, but she did. She thought about why, and she thought the answer was simple. She had made her choice. She had walked through the door. Whatever came after, she had not looked away. That was enough for one Friday. It turned out to be enough for considerably more than that. The house on Cedar Fork Road is still standing. The maple in the front yard has gone copper again this October. Right on schedule, right on time. The crow is back on the mailbox, or a crow like it is, the one that watches the drive without moving. The mountains are the same shape they have always been, layered blue and gray in the morning light, old and permanent and unmoved. Dorothy Briggs pours her coffee in the kitchen where the scuff marks are still on the hallway wall, and the jars are still organized by year in the basement, and the flag case is still on the shelf above the fireplace next to the letter from the county recorder's office. She feeds Sergeant his morning meal. She sits at the table and opens the latest notebook to a new page. She writes down the date. She thinks about what to write next. Outside, somewhere on the road that runs east and west between the mountains, there is the sound of a motorcycle. It comes closer, slows, and turns into the drive. She is already putting the second cup on. She does not need to look to know who it is. Some things you learn about the regular life, the one you build in the aftermath of the things that tested you, is that the best mornings are exactly like this. Quiet, ordinary. The coffee hot and the air cold, and the mountains where they have always been. Someone coming up the drive who knows the way. A day stretching out in front of you with nothing particularly dramatic in it, just the living of it, which is the whole point, which was always the whole point. Earl Thomas Briggs knew that. He said the best mornings were the ones where nothing in particular happened. You got up and you had your coffee and you were glad to be there. He said it with the authority of a man who had been in enough places where that simple thing was not available to understand what a gift it was when it was. He was right about that, the way he was right about most things. She had been telling people that for 40 years. She was still here to tell them. The morning was fine. The house was still standing. The record was intact. She picked up her pen and she began to write. Ruth Gallagher closed the millstone at 7 on the first Friday of October, a year to the week after the Friday that had changed things. She didn't announce it. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She just turned the sign from open to close, the same sign she'd turned the same way 1,000 times, and then she stood behind the counter for a moment in the quiet of the empty diner. The booze were clean, the coffee pot was off, the jukebox was dark. The bell over the door, repaired in November, hung straight and still in the autumn air that came under the gap at the bottom of the door. The photograph behind the register showed the courthouse steps in August. 26 men in leather cuts, and a woman in her 70s and a man who looked like he'd been assembled from the spare parts of several larger men, all of them looking at the camera or just past it. Ruth looked at the photograph for a while. Then she took off her apron and hung it on the hook by the register and got her jacket from the back and turned off the lights one by one from back to front, the way she always did. And she let herself out and locked the door behind her. It was a clear night. The stars were out over the mountains. She stood in the parking lot for a moment and looked at the sky. The same sky that had been there on that Friday. Just darker now, quieter. She drove home. She had a call in the morning, an early one, from a woman in the next county whose name she'd gotten from the legal aid office. The woman was 71 and had recently found a notice on her door from a company she didn't recognize, and she didn't know what to do. Ruth had taken the number from Kayla at the state attorney's office, who had her own list now of people to call when something like this came in. The call was at 8 in the morning. Ruth would make coffee first, sit at her kitchen table, and when the phone rang, she would answer it the way you answer calls that matter, with full attention and without hurry. She would tell the woman what she needed to know. She would tell her about keeping copies. She would tell her about the legal aid office. She would tell her, if the woman needed to hear it, that she was not alone in this, that there were people who understood what had happened to her, that the county had changed some since a Friday in October, and that one of the things it had changed was that there were more people paying attention now, more people who knew which numbers to call and were willing to call them. She would stay on the line for as long as it took. That was how the debt moved. That was what Ruth had come to understand in the year since the diner. You couldn't pay back what Cole had done in that room. You couldn't pay back what Penny had done with her phone. You couldn't pay back what Dorothy had done by walking through the door and saying no out loud. You could only carry the weight of those choices forward into the next situation, into the next room, into the next morning when someone needed someone to stay on the line. Dorothy had said something once, sitting in the millstone on a Tuesday afternoon while Ruth was closing down the lunch shift, and Harold was explaining something about why certain varieties of early apple were superior to others, which Dorothy was listening to with the expression of a person who has already made up her mind but is enjoying the conversation anyway. Dorothy had said, "The thing about gratitude is that it has to move. You can't hold it still. It curdles if you hold it still. You have to keep passing it along." Ruth thought about that in the parking lot under the October stars. She got in her car. She drove the road that ran east and west between the mountains, the same road that ran past the millstone and past the end of Cedar Fork Road and out to the county seat and back, the road that connected all the places where the things that mattered had happened. She drove with the window down a little, smelling the October air, wood smoke from somewhere up the hollow, the particular smell of autumn in Appalachia that meant the year was turning toward its quiet half. She thought about the woman in the next county, alone in her kitchen with a notice on her door and no framework for what it meant. She thought about what it felt like to be that woman, which was not a difficult thing to imagine because she had seen it walk through her door on a Friday and sit down in the corner booth and try to manage a smile it couldn't quite manage. She thought about the phone call at 8 in the morning. She thought about what she would say. She would say, "I need you to keep your copies." She would say, "I know someone who can help you." She would say, "You are not alone." She would say it the way Dorothy had learned to say it, with the steadiness of someone who has been on the receiving end of those words and knows exactly what weight they carry. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole thing. The mountains were still there above the road, dark against the star-filled sky, old and permanent and utterly indifferent to the small, fierce things that the people at their feet did to one another and for one another, and sometimes despite one another. The mountains would be there long after everyone in this story was gone, after the millstone was something else or nothing at all, after Cedar Fork Road had been paved and repaved and changed beyond recognition. But the things that had happened under those mountains on that Friday and in the year that followed, those were not nothing. The 23 properties returned. The people who had been told in kind official language that they had no recourse, who had learned piece by piece that they had more recourse than they knew. The legal aid cards on the diner tables, the calls Ruth was going to make, and the calls Dorothy was still making, and the calls that would be made by people who had learned from them that this was possible, that you could stand up in a room and the room could turn with you. Those things had happened. They were in the record now. Dorothy was adding to the record every morning. She sat down with her notebook and wrote the date and began. Cole was adding to it every time the road brought him to Cedar Fork Road. Penny was adding to it at the library, in every interaction with a patron who needed something and didn't know how to ask. Harold and James were adding to it at the counter of the millstone on Tuesday mornings. Russell Carver's son was adding to it every time he had a conversation with his father that the two of them couldn't have had before the phone call from Dorothy Briggs. The record was not a document. It was not a case file or a deed or a notebook with a blue cover. The record was the accumulated consequence of a series of choices made by ordinary people in ordinary rooms who decided, each in their own moment and for their own reasons, that what was happening in front of them was their business. That was the record. That was what endured. You could put it on a shelf above a fireplace. You could carry it in the weight of a chain against your chest. You could feel it in the way a room full of people looks at each other the morning after something terrible almost happened and didn't. It was alive. It kept going. It needed tending the way the kitchen garden needed tending, the way the porch railing needed tending, the way anything built by hand in a world that does not always mean it well needs tending. You had to show up for it. You had to keep making the choice. But the choice was always available. That was the other thing. No matter how locked the door was, no matter how bought the badge was, no matter how dense the language in the folder was, the choice was always available. The moment when one person in the room could set down their coffee and stand up was always there. It was always there. That was the thing worth knowing. That was the thing worth carrying all the way to the end. Dorothy Briggs carried it in the dog tags against her chest, Earl's name worn smooth by 40 years of touching, and in the notebook stacked on the shelf, and in the kitchen on Cedar Fork Road where the coffee was hot, and the morning was clear, and the regular life went on, which was everything she had ever wanted, and everything she had almost lost, and everything she had stood up in a room to keep. She held it all. She kept it. She was still here. I want to come back to the diner one more time, because there is something about that room I haven't fully finished saying. When Decker walked out and the door swung shut behind him and the briefcase hit the floor and the room exhaled all at once, there was a moment, maybe 10 seconds long, where nobody moved and nobody spoke. Just 20 people standing or sitting in a space that had been, 60 seconds before, a place where something very bad was trying to happen and which was now just a diner again. The coffee pot was still going. The television above the counter was still playing a weather forecast on mute. The jukebox was still dark. In that 10 seconds, something was decided, though no one would have been able to say afterward that they had made a decision. What was decided was that the room was going back to being a room, that the people in it were going back to being people who had ordinary afternoons ahead of them, who would drive home on Route 119 and make dinner and put their kids to bed and tell someone what had happened today. Or maybe not tell anyone. Maybe just carry it quietly the way you carry things that are too large for regular conversation. What was also decided, without anyone saying it, was that none of them were the same as they'd been that morning. You can't watch what they watched and come back unchanged. You can't watch a man you've never met stand up alone in a locked room because an old woman was being hurt and come away with your previous understanding of what people are capable of fully intact. Cole had demonstrated something. Not a technique or a skill or a physical capacity, though those things were visible in the 4 seconds it took to put 2 trained men on the floor. What he had demonstrated was simpler and harder to name. He had demonstrated that the calculus of looking away is a choice, not a necessity. That the 20 people in that room had been making a choice without knowing they were making it, had been choosing the comfort of inaction under the story that there was nothing they could do, and that when one person unmade that choice, the story dissolved. The truckers went back to their food, but they went back differently. The 2 old men resumed their argument, but they resumed it knowing they were the kind of men who had watched something and stayed seated, and that knowledge was going to live in them now in whatever way such knowledge lives in people. The young mother with the toddler held her son and breathed and knew that she had raised her phone at the right moment, which was something she would tell him someday when he was old enough, which was something that would be part of how he understood what his mother was. None of them were heroes. Cole was not a hero. He was a man who had made a decision about who he was, years before he needed to be that person in a specific room on a specific Friday. Dorothy was not a hero. She was a woman who kept her copies and drove to the millstone and said no when no was what was needed. Penny was not a hero. She was a young mother who held up her phone and kept holding it when it would have been much easier to put it down. Ordinary people doing the things that ordinary people are capable of when they decide to be. That is the whole story. It is also the beginning of the next one, because the next one is already happening somewhere. In some diner or church hall or county office or kitchen, with a man in a nice suit and a folder full of dense language, the next version of this is underway. The next Eleanor or Dorothy is sitting across from the next Flynn and doesn't yet know what she has in her purse, or what she's capable of, or what the person in the back booth might do if she says no out loud. The only question is whether the person in the back booth is you, or whether you are one of the 20. You already know which one you want to be. You knew it before you started this story. That's why you're still here, at the end of it. The question is whether you'll remember that when the moment comes. Cole Weaver set down his coffee on a Friday afternoon in October in Harlan County, Kentucky, and everything after that was consequence. The house on Cedar Fork Road stood. The machine stopped. 23 people got their land back. A room full of people remembered that they had legs. One man, one choice. One moment when looking away was available and wasn't taken. That's all it takes. That's always all it takes. Dorothy Briggs is still at the table on Cedar Fork Road with her coffee and her notebook and the morning light coming through the window. She is writing the date at the top of a new page. She is thinking about what to write next. Outside, a motorcycle turns into the drive. She is already putting the second cup on. The morning is fine. The record is standing. She begins. One last thing, because this story earns it, and because the people in it deserve to have it said plainly. There is a particular kind of loneliness that is specific to the old and rural America, and it is not the loneliness of not having people around. It is the loneliness of invisibility, of being in the same room as everyone, and having everyone look through you, past you, around you, not from malice, but from the much more common failure of attention. The way we all learn to stop seeing what we've decided doesn't concern us. The lonely old woman in the diner, the couple at the counter who stopped going places together, the man who worked the same farm for 60 years and doesn't know who to call when the truck won't start and his knees won't let him get under it anymore. They are in the rooms with us. They have always been in the rooms with us. And the question of whether we see them, really see them, whether we notice the bruise on the cheekbone or the way someone's holding their arm close to their ribs, whether we register that something is wrong and allow ourselves to feel the weight of that registration. That question is answered not in any dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. Cole Weaver had been coming to the millstone once or twice a week for 7 years. He had watched the room the way he had always watched rooms, and he had kept to himself the way he had learned to keep to himself, and he had eaten his eggs and paid and ridden away. He had been doing what most of us do, which is to be present in a space without quite being present for the people in it. What changed on that Friday was not his capability. He had always been capable of what he did. What changed was that he saw Dorothy, really saw her. The bruise, the tags, the fear, the woman behind the fear, who had clearly learned to take what came and make herself small and hope the trouble passed. He saw her, and he let himself feel the weight of what he was seeing, and he did not put it down. That is available to all of us. Not the physical capacity, the seeing, the allowing, the decision to let the weight of someone else's situation land in you rather than deflecting it, which is the constant unconscious work we all do to stay comfortable in the presence of other people's discomfort. It is tiring. It costs something. You cannot afford to do it for everyone, every moment, because the weight would be insupportable. But you can do it in the moments when it most needs doing, when the person in front of you is someone whose situation can be changed by being seen, by having one person in the room decide that looking away is not an option. Dorothy was that person on that Friday. She is not an exceptional woman in the ways that would make her a story if she hadn't been through this. She is exactly as ordinary as the woman down the road you might have noticed if you'd been paying attention. She is the grandmother whose driveway needs plowing after a storm, if someone noticed. She is the widow who still puts up 40 jars of tomatoes every fall because that is who she is, and she doesn't know how to be someone different, if someone thought to ask. She is the woman who drives a Buick with a dent in the quarter panel that was never fixed, and keeps a cat that sleeps on her late husband's side of the bed, and goes to the millstone every Friday for the tea and the eggs and the conversation, and has been doing all of this alone for 40 years with a kind of grace that nobody has ever remarked on because nobody was watching closely enough. Someone watched closely enough on that Friday. That is the whole of it. Watch closely enough. That is the lesson. That is the entire lesson. Everything else is consequence. Dorothy Briggs is still there. She is at the kitchen table with her coffee and the morning light and the record she has been building for 41 years in the house on Cedar Fork Road. Sargent is on the counter where he knows he shouldn't be, looking at her with the certainty of a creature who has never once doubted that the world was organized for his comfort. The flag case is on the shelf. The notebook is open. And outside, coming down the road between the mountains in the October morning, the sound of a motorcycle, steady and unhurried, the way all good things come when they come to stay. She is already putting the second cup on. The house is hers. The morning is fine. She is still here. I want to say one more thing about Dorothy Briggs, and then I will let the morning have her. She is not a woman who thinks of herself as brave. She has thought about this in the notebooks, in the way she has been thinking about most things since October, with more attention than she used to give them. Bravery implies that you weighed the cost and chose the more dangerous path in full knowledge of what it would cost. She didn't do that. She didn't have a full accounting of what saying no would cost her, what walking into that diner with the papers in her purse would cost her, what holding her ground when Flynn came back would cost her. She just did those things because the alternative was to let the house be taken and the record erased and the life she had built with Earl be dissolved into someone else's profit. And that alternative was unacceptable in a way that went below the level of decision. It simply was not something she could do. She told Cole this once on the porch in the early spring, when the maple was just starting to show green and the air still had winter in it at the edges. She said, "I don't think I was brave. I think I just ran out of other options." Cole said, "That's what brave usually is, running out of other options and finding out what you do next." She thought about that for a while. She said, "Earl used to say you don't know what kind of person you are until the moment asks you." She paused. "I guess I know now." Cole said, "You knew before, you just didn't have the proof yet." She put her hand over the dog tags and looked at the mountains and thought about Earl at 27 and herself at 23, and all the years between then and this porch and this morning, and the particular way the spring light came through the maple when the leaves were just coming in. She said, "I think I'll go make more coffee." He said, "I'll still be here." She went inside. The house held its shape around her, 41 years of it, every corner and floor plank and jar on the basement shelf and mark on the hallway wall. The whole accumulated record of a life lived in one place by people who understood that the place was not incidental. She put the kettle on and listened to it start to heat and looked out the window at the mountains and thought that Earl would have liked this morning very much. The maple coming in, the quiet, the sound of someone out on the porch who would still be there when the coffee was ready. Some mornings are enough. This was one of those mornings. She was still here. She would keep being here for as long as the morning lasted. She poured the coffee. She went back out to the porch. She began,